And I remember someone mentioning that leasing in India is, attending a big fat Indian wedding where everyone is optimistic about it, but no one knows who's financing it, and someone ends up with bankruptcy.
India's strength is also to a certain extent its weakness. And vice versa. It's an enormous country, an enormous potential market, but then with bigger markets become more vested interest, which means that things can move a bit slower.
One of the key tests will also be moving forward, how we actually implement it. When I say we implement it in terms of the enforcement machinery, let's say if this were to be tested before the tax tribunals, if this were to be tested, let's say in courts of law, are we able to maintain a similar consistent approach?
As someone who has, Indian heritage and family back in India, I'm, the regular trips I've made ever since I was sort of very young to now, to back to India every year, it's changed enormously, right? Just the changes in the infrastructure, in the economy, and how open people are, the outlook internationally for investors is hugely different to India 15, 20 years ago.
Hi Richard. Hi Randeep. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mansi Singh. I'm a partner with BT3 Advaya, which is a full-service law firm with offices in Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore. And aviation is an important part of both Ramesh and my practice. I'm presently serving as the Vice President APAC for International Aerospace Women's Association. And I'm also serving as the Senior Chair of the Aviation Law Committee of the International Power Association. Richard, you've been involved with aviation transactions in India for decades, and Randeep, you have extensive experience. So you've seen the industry move from the Kingfisher days to Jet Airways to now Go First. But I think that's still, until recently at least, we were still deemed to be a risky jurisdiction. And I remember someone mentioning that leasing in India is, attending a big fat Indian wedding where everyone is optimistic about it, but no one knows who's financing it, and someone ends up with bankruptcy. So I hope that image is now going to change. But until now, of course, we've been deemed as a risky jurisdiction, and there have been creditors have faced hassles. You have clients, the clients that you've represented who did have a tough time, whether it was in the Kingfisher insolvency or Jet Airways insolvency, or more recently with Go First. But I think, the questions which were being asked by the lessors were that, will we ever get our aircraft back if we lease it to India? Or, is filing a suit just a process of the repossession in India? Because invariably, unless there's some sort of litigation, we don't get our aircraft back. So while, I think all these things were happening simultaneously, India's government has been very ambitious, and we've been also wanting to set ourselves up as the leasing and financing hub. So interestingly, and of course, we'll delve into your experience with this, but I think now we've taken steps. Not too early. I think we've learned our lessons, and we've realized that unless we fix a few things, and the critical one being the Cape Town Convention Act, unless we had that act in place, which would, remove any conflicts with the domestic law, particularly the insolvency and bankruptcy code, there was no way to establish India as the leasing and financing hub. The act is obviously in place now. How it pans out is something that we could discuss in the podcast.
Thanks, Mansi, for that setting the context. Really appreciate it. Without further monopolizing the conversation, maybe I can turn this over to you, Richard and Randeep. Maybe if you could just quickly share your a little bit of brief introduction about yourself and your practice, and then how did the India transaction thing start, and how deeply involved are you with Indian transactions? So maybe that could be kickoff. Maybe Richard, do you want to go first, and then maybe Randeep?
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to. I think I've been working on Indian aircraft transactions for as long as I've been a qualified lawyer, which is it was 20 years actually this year. And I've been lucky enough to work with many Indian people as well involved in the industry, both in London and also in India. The UK has a large Indian diaspora, and lots of people work in the banks from India as well. And so I had the opportunity to work with them, and they've been transacting business in India, aviation business in India for for as long as I've been a lawyer. And so the first transaction I did was an operating lease transaction to Kingfisher Airlines. And I've had the opportunity to work on transactions involving all of the major Indian airlines, some of which of course aren't with us any longer, but two of which most definitely are. And I think the appetite and the desire and the enthusiasm for aviation in India has been there for as long as I've been doing transaction. Lots of people have been very successful in transacting aviation transactions in India. Of course, there have been some big stories where things haven't gone very well and things have gone wrong. But I think in some respects that kind of shows its promise and that shows its commitment. And I think definitely within the last 6 months, with passing new legislation, there's a lot of pause for optimism, and we are very much there in terms of getting it right, and we can look to the future for Indian aviation. So that's sort of my history. But I'm a bit older than Randeep, so I've got a little bit more than Randeep, but Randeep's pretty fit this especially a little bit more into a short space of time.
Thanks, Richard. It's nice to know. I mean, I'm a little bit younger. My history starts sort of in a similar vein. Actually, I think my first experience of India was some Kingfisher repossessions, sort of starting off very much in that world when India was very much seen as a risky jurisdiction. It's sort of been the success of Kingfisher to some degree, and then the sort of when things turned wrong. And then it's been a history, right, that has kind of gone through Kingfisher, then Jet, and then Go First. There's been lots of success stories along the way, and I think people have seen the promise of India and as we said, the burgeoning middle class, the order books that have now come in. India is definitely a jurisdiction that everybody in the aviation community is focused on. And I think that has been something that even historically throughout my career has been the case. Probably more so on the leasing side than the financing side. And then I suppose in the more recent history, I've been very involved, along with Richard, on the sort of gift city aspects, particularly the sort of financings and the structures that have come into place. So with essentially all of the Indian airlines in some way, shape or form, which has been that transition, I think, for the Indian market and for how people view India, and we can kind of come on to the Cape Town Act and the work that the AWG and others have been doing in the jurisdiction. But that I think is the sort of history that we both have with India.
Thanks for those initial remarks. Maybe I'll straight away dive into what topic that Mansi alluded to when she spoke at the beginning. This whole perception of risk and the repossession risk that we've all seen over the years with several of the airlines that have eventually ended up disappearing in India. To what extent do you think, Richard and Randeep, things have changed on the ground as you see it from your perspective? I know there's been significant movement, but are you able to perceive it on the ground?
If I go first on that one, I mean, I think there's two facets to that question. I think there's the changes with respect to regulation and the law and everything, that all the good stuff that we'll talk about here today. But I also think there's a change in the market and perception, right? In the sense that the airlines that remain there in India today and are prevalent are very different credits to the credits of the past. I think in reality, we now have airlines that have very strong shareholder support, airlines that are investment grade, and I think that changes people's risk perception. It changes also people's outlook towards India, right? So there's the regulatory side, but there's also the pure commercial business aspects where you have airlines that are just much stronger than I think historically was the case. Richard, maybe I'll hand over to you to kind of go through the regulatory side and the changes there on the ground.
Well, I mean, I think when so we're talking about sort of changes on the ground in terms of attitudes, are we? And yeah, I mean, I think sort of law is a human construct, isn't it? And I think it's sort of driven by cultural changes. And I think that India's strength is also to a certain extent its weakness. I mean, and vice versa. I mean, it's an enormous country, an enormous potential market, but then with bigger markets become more vested interests, which means that things can move a bit slower. But there has, generally been a shift, I think, in India over the past, say, decade, where they want to realize their economic ambitions, across the board, not just in the aviation industry. And I think certainly within this last, since I started work until now, I think there's more of an understanding that actually being creditor friendly and being friendly towards international investors actually improves things for Indian people and the domestic markets and the Indian consumers. And I think people understand this now, whereby creating a more creditor friendly regime in India reduces the cost of finance for the airlines, which results in cheaper tickets for Indian consumers. Whereas I think before there was a bit more of perception that it was up to the government to protect Indian businesses from predatory international financiers. So there has definitely been a flip, and I think there's a lot more kind of internationalism and a lot more desire to make India a much more kind of welcoming place for people to do business.
On that, I mean, I totally agree, because I think as someone who has Indian heritage and family back in India, I'm the regular trips I've made ever since I was sort of very young to now back to India every year, it's changed enormously, right? I mean, just the changes in the infrastructure and the economy and how open people are. The outlook internationally for investors is hugely different to India 15, 20 years ago.
That's a fair point. And I just wanted to step back a little bit from India and then maybe take a more macro viewpoint in terms of people operating in the sector for a while now. What are some of the macro trends you're seeing with all of this geopolitical things going on? Where do you see generally the aviation industry, also particularly the leasing industry, with the focus on ESG and all of those things? Are you picking up any particular trends across the world or in particular regions of the world which could be relevant not just for India but generally for all legal practitioners?
Shall I say that one, Randeep, first? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big question. I think, in the right now, I think the industry is under pressure in terms of from supply side issues. The demand for new aircraft very much outstrips, I think, the supply. And I think industry predictions are that supply side issue will be fixed, but it's going to take a couple of years yet. And that's providing, an interesting period in the industry. It's very hot at the moment. I think we saw in the press yesterday, one of the biggest lessors, ALC, was acquired by a consortium of other industry participants. There's a lot of M&A action, and there's a lot of value in second-hand aircraft as well because of the delays to the development of new aircraft. So I think the demand for aircraft is only getting bigger across the world, because as more and more countries begin to develop, really the aviation industry is developed alongside it. And, it gives a great opportunity for all sorts of other people to become participants in the jurisdictions. So, for example, China with COMAC, I think we're predicting in the next few years, COMAC will begin to manufacture a lot more aircraft as well and become a bigger player in the manufacturer space. And generally, there'll be a lot more competition. I think India will be part of that as well.
SAF is going to be the way that the industry moves forward from the sort of ESG side, and that's going to apply globally, right? And that links to lots of other industries that are talking about the production of SAF, also how green the production that can be, along with carbon credits. So there's lots there on the ESG side, and lots of progress to be made. I think also alongside kind of new technologies and new aircraft that are coming into airlines fleets across the world. The only other thing I would say on the leasing side is I think there's lots of opportunities, right? I mean, we sort of spoke there about the supply chain issues with the OEMs, but that also reaches out to the engine OEMs, right? I mean, there's lots of demand for engines. There's a real shortage of supply, and we've seen new lessors coming into the market and being very, very successful, and a lot of trading in that space as well. So overall, I think it's fair to say that it's a very, very hot market at the moment.
And I think you mentioned about SAF, Mansi. I'll hand it over to you in a minute, but I just wanted to just supplement, because given our own agricultural focus in India, I think SAF could be really something that India should explore. Because this could really be a game changer, and hopefully, that will be on the priority list as we move along. So anyway, let's but still early stages on that front. Mansi, over to you.
I think the only thing, of course, we could be the front runners when it comes to production, but the only thing that we will have to be conscious of is the fact that India is a very price sensitive market. So how do we balance that? Because if you look at the statistics, I think it shows that even if there is, a couple of dollars difference in the airfare, the bookings almost drop by double digit. So I think that would be the challenge for India, as opposed to, let's say, Europe, where probably it's not a very price sensitive market. So I think interesting times ahead. So just pivoting to now some real transactions that you've actually been involved in recently, Richard and Randeep, starting with the merger of Air India and Vistaras. Your team represented 11 different lessors and financier groups. So we would love to know how was that experience and any practical issues that anyone who's doing business in India need to be mindful of.
That is, it was obviously amazing that we were sort of on both sides of that transaction. And I guess whilst it was an M&A deal, it also shows the strength of India, right? There was flexibility and lots of challenges in that transaction in particular, where you had all of these lessors, all of these different financing parties, lots of investors, everything needing to be done on a very short timeline at a specific point in time. And it shows the strength of the regulation changes. Sometimes the story can be overly negative on the sort of Indian regulatory regime and sort of the DGCA, etc. But that's a real success story, right? That was one where the airline got it. Both airlines got it done, and it was a huge deal in the market and a huge way of doing it, not only for India but also globally. Like those type of transactions and those type of mergers of sort of two major airlines don't come around that often.
Now, moving on to the Gift City experience, you've been one of the first firms who've actually done a commercial aircraft finance transaction from the Gift City when you advised Standard Chartered on the financing of their 320neo aircraft. So how was that experience? Can we already say that India is definitely on the way to become aircraft leasing and financing hub soon?
I think the Vistara deal was a tremendous transaction for us because it was only really the second one in the market in as far as using gift, and I think ours had a slightly unique aspect to it as well. So to some extent, it was the first of its kind in the market. And Randeep again was acting for the airline on that one, although it was prior to joining Watson Farley and Williams. So it was our introduction to each other, and so I mean that was a tremendous transaction to work on. I think gift is in terms of the aviation industry. I mean, gift has been around for 10 years, right? So it's already been enormous success for India, I think. And I mean, we sometimes do some non-aviation deals, so ECB financings and things like that. And, we've seen banks, international banks, use their branches in India for a number of years before we did the aviation transaction. And I think it is a bit of a game changer for India in terms of attracting, not just increasing existing finance, but definitely it does open the doors to a lot more different financing structures, including with regards to, hold on a second, Sam. I was getting a bit of static there, including with regards to, say, Japanese structures as well, which previously wasn't really open to Indian airlines because of the tax rules and because of the withholding taxes. So certainly for the airlines, I think we've seen a really good promising start. A lot of transactions already, and it's not just finance transactions that have been routed through the airline gift subsidiaries. They're using it for all sorts of different transactions as well. And I think that will just continue to grow as well. I think we've generally seen only finance transactions executed, but it might be the case that airlines start to use them for operating these transactions as well. And I think, so it will grow for the airlines. I mean, as in terms of it becoming a hub for leasing, I think that's going to be a more kind of longer term project, I think. And I know that the guys that organise gift, administer gift, they're very ambitious. And I think they're open to all sorts of different suggestions as well to make sure that happens. But I think we do have to bear in mind that, Ireland kind of dominates the world in this respect. And there's been a few people that try to compete with Ireland, and they do to a certain extent, but, they found it quite difficult to compete with Ireland to become, to take that much of a larger share, market share. But, it might potentially be the case in the future that the gift is able to compete with Ireland a bit more. I think there'll be a few changes that will need to be made. It will take a bit longer because, Ireland's been doing it for sort of 30, 40 years. It's built up an enormous ecosystem. And that kind of thing takes time. But, as a long-term goal, that's fine. But I don't think that should detract from the, enormous short-term and I think, to come medium-term, enormous and positive impact gift has had on the aviation industry, just through that limited aspect that we're looking at, which is helping to finance aircraft for Indian Airlines.
And I think if I may just come in here, I think one of the key tests will also be moving forward, how we actually implement it. When I say we implement it in terms of the enforcement machinery, let's say if this were to be tested. I think if I may just come in here, I think one of the key tests will also be moving forward, how we actually implement it. When I say we implement it in terms of the enforcement machinery, let's say if this were to be tested before the tax tribunals, if this were to be tested, let's say in courts of law, are we able to maintain a similar consistent approach? I think that will be the real test. And I think that's where I think we'll have to continue to stay the course as a complete jurisdiction. And it's not just at the time of leasing, and should, let's say, there be an enforcement action later on, whether we're able to follow through on that in similar fashion. I just want to ask, if you were to be asked to suggest a couple of things or 2-3 things to the Indian policymakers that could make it a little more attractive, maybe remove some of the pain points, would you be able to think of 1 or 2 things that probably we could do better?
I think there's I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think it goes back to the point that we were just sort of making. I think India's ambition should be to sort of improve on the ecosystem that's been built elsewhere, right? If you look not just Dublin, but also Singapore and other jurisdictions that have sort of done it to some degree, and China as well. There are success stories that I think people can do, but talking about concrete changes, I think an obvious one or a clear one at the gift city level would be sort of the implementation of SPVs, sort of special purpose vehicles, and also looking at kind of orphan structures, so that the structures that are used in, the Cayman Islands, in Ireland, that very much support bankruptcy remoteness, the lender's view of the transaction, and kind of ring fencing of the aviation asset of the aircraft, I think is one of the ones that policymakers should certainly look very hard at, because that there are currently restrictions in gift city around cash capitalization, etc., that impact the ability currently for gift to be used in that way.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, look, I think arguably kind of India did it back in, was it 2010, was it, when it originally ratified the Cape Town Convention? It was already well ahead of many other jurisdictions in doing that. Unfortunately, it didn't work out as well as what everybody would have hoped, but I think India's done it again with the recent legislation. I think, there's still a lot of jurisdictions which haven't ratified the Cape Town Convention. The vast majority of jurisdictions around the world haven't done. And so India is ahead of the game, and ahead of the game of many countries that have ratified the Cape Town Convention in taking further steps to ensure that, that the treaty takes precedence over domestic law where there's a conflict. So, look, I think that in that respect, I think as we spoke about global macroeconomic trends and the growth of aviation around the world, the Cape Town Convention will continue to be something which countries look at to implement, just like India did, in order to attract foreign investors, because you need that kind of consistency and certainty on cross-border enforcement over assets in order to attract foreign investors. My advice would be to continue in the same vein and fix things as and when they need to be fixed, and continue on that path to continuous improvement.